I've been turning this over in my head all week, and I still can't believe what I'm watching unfold. Canada, the country that sends 75% of its exports to the United States, the country that for decades has been the most economically dependent major nation on a single trading partner anywhere in the world, is systematically building a network designed to neutralize American economic leverage. And it's working. Since March 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney has executed four distinct strategic moves that, taken together, represent the most aggressive economic counteroffensive any American ally has launched against Washington in the modern era. This isn't posturing. This isn't rhetoric. This is a coordinated campaign that's already reshaping trade flows, defense contracts, and alliance structures across three continents. The four moves: the Buy Canadian policy, a strategic partnership with China, entry into Europe's safe defense fund, and a public call to arms for the world's middle powers delivered at Davos that received a standing ovation from global leaders. That last part matters. Standing ovations at Davos are almost unheard of. That tells you something about how the rest of the world is interpreting what's happening. So here's what actually happened. The tariff war kicked off on February 1st, 2025, when President Trump signed orders imposing 25% tariffs on virtually all Canadian imports, with energy products taking a 10% hit. By August, those baseline tariffs jumped to 35%. The economic impact was immediate. Auto plants in Brampton and Ingersoll, Ontario went idle. Canadian travel to the United States dropped 40% almost overnight, and polling showed 62% of Canadians plan to avoid America entirely for the foreseeable future. But here's where Carney's approach diverges from what most analysts expected. Instead of going hat-in-hand to Washington to negotiate sector by sector, begging for exemptions the way previous Canadian governments had done, he went in the opposite direction entirely. Move number one came into force on December 16, 2025, the Buy Canadian policy. This thing fundamentally rewrote how Ottawa spends taxpayer money. All federal contracts over $25 million now have to prioritize Canadian suppliers, Canadian content, Canadian steel, aluminum, and wood. Based on what's been reported, this could redirect as much as $70 billion in public investment toward Canadian-made products and services. Think about what that number represents. That's not a stimulus program. That's not a one-time injection. That's a permanent restructuring of how the Canadian government allocates its purchasing power. And there's a second layer to this that most coverage has missed. The Buy Canadian policy also includes a $5 billion strategic response fund for businesses hit by U.S. tariffs, another $1 billion added to the Regional Tariff Response Initiative that was set up earlier in 2025, and a reskilling program for up to 50,000 workers affected by trade disruptions. This is the government creating shock absorbers while simultaneously redirecting procurement. They're cushioning the immediate blow while building long-term alternatives. Carney himself framed it as moving from reliance to resilience, from uncertainty to prosperity. That's political language, obviously, but the funding mechanisms are real, and the ripple effects are already visible. Two countries are now competing to build Canada's next submarine fleet, and both Germany and South Korea are falling over themselves to invest in Canadian industry because they understand that winning the contract means meeting Buy Canadian requirements. ThyssenKrupp has signed agreements with Vancouver's Seaspan shipyard. Hanwha Ocean committed $270 million to invest in Algoma Steel in Sault Ste. Marie, a city that's been hammered by American tariffs. The submarine contract alone could be worth $60 billion when you factor in maintenance and operations over 3 decades. But the actual platform accounts for only 20% of the evaluation criteria. Local maintenance capabilities represent 50%. Economic benefits are 15%. Financial capacity is 15%. Let that sink in. The submarine itself is less than a quarter of the decision. More than half is about what these companies will do for Canada's industrial base. And here's what makes this particularly strategic. Canada has 4 aging submarines right now. Only one is operational. The HMCS Corner Brook just came out of maintenance, but the other 3 are sitting in dry dock. These boats were built for the British Royal Navy in the 1980s. Canada bought them used in the late 1990s, thinking they'd be a cost-effective interim solution. Vice Admiral Angus Topshee, the commander of the Royal Canadian Navy, said in December that they're down to a single operational submarine. He told reporters he's hoping the government makes a decision this year because they literally cannot afford to wait. So this isn't just economic policy dressed as defense spending. There's genuine operational urgency driving the timeline. But Ottawa is leveraging that urgency to extract maximum industrial concessions from bidders. South Korea's Hanwha Ocean says they can deliver the first submarine by 2032 if Canada signs this year. 4 submarines by 2035. Germany's ThyssenKrupp is looking at 2035 for the first boat, 3 years later than the Korean offer. That delivery gap matters when your current fleet is held together with hope and maintenance budgets. This is industrial policy disguised as military procurement, and it's being replicated across multiple sectors simultaneously. I'm not sure I'm reading this right on this next part, so tell me what you think. Move number 2 dropped in January 2026. Carney flew to Beijing, sat down with Xi Jinping, and signed what both countries are calling a landmark strategic partnership. The core deal? Canada will allow up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into its market at a 6.1% tariff rate, down from 100%. That number grows to 70,000 vehicles over 5 years. In exchange, China is slashing tariffs on Canadian canola seed from 84% to roughly 15%, and removing duties on canola meal, lobsters, crabs, and peas. The filings show this unlocks nearly $3 billion in export orders for Canadian farmers and fishers. China has also committed to begin investing in Canada's auto sector within 3 years. Now here's the context that makes this significant. In 2024, Canada mirrored the United States by imposing that 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. This was coordinated action with Washington. Carney just broke that coordination publicly and deliberately. The announcement came from Beijing. The optics were unmistakable. President Trump responded within days, threatening 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if Ottawa made a deal with China. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent accused Carney of virtue signaling to his globalist friends at Davos. But here's the thing that keeps nagging at me. Trump himself told reporters afterward that signing a deal with China is, quote, a good thing, what Carney should be doing. So which is it? The messaging from Washington has been contradictory, which suggests this caught them off guard. What we're learning is that the EV deal serves multiple purposes beyond the immediate trade benefits. It creates a competitive floor in Canada's auto market. Chinese manufacturers now have market access, which forces every other automaker to compete on price. And the requirement that 50% of imported Chinese EVs cost under $35,000 by 2030 means affordable electric vehicles are coming to Canadian consumers, regardless of what happens with domestic production. This is the part where I want your perspective. Are you starting to see how these pieces connect? Move number 3 happened on December 1st, 2025. Canada became the first non-European Union country to join the EU's Security Action for Europe program. SAFE provides up to 150 billion euros in loans for joint military procurement, and Canada now has access to that pipeline. The implications are substantial. Canadian defense companies can now participate in EU-backed procurement projects. They can tap low-interest EU loans to produce everything from drones to artillery systems. And this creates formal industrial partnerships with European manufacturers that bypass American defense contractors entirely. Carney had explicitly stated that more than 70 cents of every dollar of Canadian military capital spending would no longer go to the United States. SAFE is the mechanism that makes that possible. The UK tried to join this same program. Negotiations collapsed in November 2025 over disagreements about the entry fee and participation terms. Canada got in. Britain didn't. That distinction matters because it shows Ottawa was willing to accept whatever conditions Brussels required to secure access. Internal communications suggest the entry fee is substantial, but Defense Minister David McGuinty has declined to disclose the exact amount. What's clear is that Canada prioritized this partnership over cost concerns. And then there's the Swedish connection. Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly has publicly acknowledged that Canada is in talks with Saab about potentially ditching the $19 billion F-35 fighter jet contract in favor of Swedish Gripen jets. Saab has promised 12,600 aerospace manufacturing jobs in Canada if they win. The F-35 is an American aircraft built by Lockheed Martin. There are documented concerns within Ottawa about the kill switch, the ability for the United States to remotely disable capabilities on F-35s if they decide a country isn't playing nice. Documents revealed this became a genuine security concern after Trump started making noise about Canada becoming the 51st state. But there's another dimension to this that's worth understanding. The Carney administration was supposed to decide on the F-35 versus Gripen competition last fall. They've left the decision open-ended. Industry Minister Melanie Joly told reporters, "We believe we didn't get enough when it comes to the F-35. She's planning to meet with Lockheed Martin executives in early 2026 to demand greater economic benefits, using the Swedish offer as leverage. Her exact words were, "We think that we can use military procurement to get more." That's the playbook. Every major contract becomes a negotiation for industrial concessions. Canada is a seller's market for defense equipment right now because they have the budget, the urgency, and the political will to credibly threaten alternative purchases. And the numbers support the approach. Canada has committed to immediately meeting NATO's 2% of GDP defense spending target and eventually reaching 5%. The defense budget for the next 5 years includes $81.8 billion in new investment. They've established a new defense investment agency to fast-track procurement. This is a spending bonanza for whoever wins these contracts. And Ottawa is weaponizing that leverage. If Canada chooses German submarines and Swedish fighter jets, they're essentially building a completely new defense industrial partnership that bypasses the United States entirely. That's Move 3, defense diversification through European integration. Move 4 is the ideological framework that holds everything together. January 20th, 2026. Carney delivers a speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos that analysts are already comparing to Louis Saint Laurent's 1947 Grey Lecture, the speech that defined Canada's post-war international role. The core message was blunt. The rules-based international order enabled by American hegemony has experienced a rupture, not a transition. Great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. Carney's solution? Middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace described it as the first time that the leader of a close U.S. ally had the courage to stand up to President Trump and say enough is enough. He avoided the euphemisms, the weasel words, the sycophantic appeals that Western governments have been using to register their disquiet. He received a standing ovation. Trump responded the following day from the same stage. Canada lives because of the United States. They should be grateful. I watched your Prime Minister yesterday. He wasn't so grateful. Remember that, Mark. Carney didn't retract anything. In a subsequent phone call with Trump, Carney told reporters, he said, "I meant what I said in Davos." Treasury Secretary Bessent claimed Carney was aggressively walking back his remarks. Carney's office denied it. There's been no official readout of that conversation. Here's where it starts to click. These 4 moves aren't isolated policy decisions. They form a coherent strategy aimed at a single objective, reducing American economic leverage over Canada to the point where tariff threats lose their coercive power. Buy Canadian redirects government spending away from American suppliers. The China deal creates alternative markets for Canadian exports and alternative sources for consumer goods. SAFE provides access to European defense financing and manufacturing. And the Davos speech builds political momentum for a coalition of countries pursuing the same hedging strategy. Canada is also pursuing free trade pacts with India, Thailand, the Philippines, ASEAN, and Mercosur. The explicit government target is doubling non-U.S. exports by 2030 and boosting exports to China by 50% by that same date. Based on what's been reported, Carney's calculation appears to be that bilateral negotiations with a hegemon always favor the hegemon. Middle powers compete with each other to be the most accommodating. This is not sovereignty. It is the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination. But collective investments in resilience are cheaper than everyone building their own fortresses. Shared standards reduce fragmentation, and complementarities are positive sum. So here's the question that I keep coming back to. Is this actually working? Recent disclosures indicate that Canada avoided a recession despite the tariff war. GDP grew in the 3rd quarter. The submarine contract has Germany and South Korea investing in Canadian steel production and shipyard infrastructure before a winner is even selected. Chinese investment in Canada's auto sector is now on the table for the first time, and the political dynamics have shifted in ways that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Conservative opposition leader Pierre Poilievre, who has built his brand on opposing liberal policies, voiced restrained support for Carney's Davos speech. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, a conservative, joined Carney on his trip to China and characterized the deal as, quote, a very positive day for Canada-China relations. The tariff threat hasn't disappeared. Trump is still threatening 100% duties if Canada pursues deeper integration with Beijing. The CUSMA review is scheduled for this summer, and Ottawa has no guarantee of favorable terms. But the leverage equation has changed. Canada now has options it didn't have 18 months ago. European defense partnerships, Asian export markets, a coalition of middle powers watching to see if this approach works. The risk, of course, is that Carney is overplaying his hand. Some defense experts worry that all this political involvement in procurement decisions could backfire if companies challenge contracts in court. And critics point out that 75% of Canadian exports still go to the United States. You can't diversify overnight. But here's what nobody's talking about. If this strategy succeeds, even partially, it creates a template. Other American allies are watching. Australia, Japan, the EU members themselves, the UK, which just failed to join SAFE, might reconsider its approach. Carney explicitly said at Davos that Canada's path is wide open to any country willing to take it with us. That's not a trade policy. That's an invitation to build an alternative order. And here's the data point that suggests this might have staying power, regardless of who's in charge in Ottawa. During Carney's trip to China, Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe traveled with him. Saskatchewan produces more than half of Canada's canola. Moe is a conservative who has been critical of liberal policies for years. But there he was in Beijing, calling the deal a positive step forward. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, who had until then been opposed to aggressive trade action against the United States, said Canada needed to respond to Trump's mutually destructive policy. Quebec Premier François Legault ordered a review of all procurement contracts involving American suppliers. This isn't just federal policy anymore. Provincial governments across the political spectrum are moving in the same direction. The consensus appears to be hardening. Now, I want to be clear about the risks here because there are real ones. First, 75% of Canadian exports still go to the United States. You can redirect government procurement and sign deals with China and Europe, but Canadian businesses are deeply integrated with American supply chains. Those links don't disappear because Ottawa changes its priorities. Second, the CUSMA renegotiation is coming this summer. Trump has already signaled he wants major concessions. The existing agreement exempts most Canadian exports from the 35% tariffs that apply to goods outside the treaty. If that protection disappears or weakens, the economic pain gets significantly worse. Third, some defense analysts worry that all this political involvement in procurement could expose contracts to legal challenges. If either submarine bidder feels the process was politically biased rather than based on technical merit, they could tie up the entire procurement in courts for years. And Canada cannot afford delays when it has one working submarine. Fourth, China comes with its own risks. The two Michaels detention, the intelligence concerns around Huawei, the documented cases of Chinese state interference in Canadian elections. Deepening economic ties with Beijing creates dependencies that could be exploited. Carney acknowledged this at Davos when he talked about guardrails and engagement with open eyes. But some critics argue the guardrails are already insufficient. So is Carney brilliant or reckless? That's the trillion-dollar question. And honestly, I don't have a clean answer. Walk me through your logic on this one. What happens if Canada actually pulls this off? What happens if the four-move counterattack proves that middle powers can resist economic coercion when they coordinate? Because if Carney's gamble works, we're not just watching a trade dispute, we're watching the first serious attempt to restructure the Western alliance since the end of the Cold War. The old assumption that American allies had no choice but to accommodate Washington's demands is being tested in real time. And whether you think that's necessary adaptation or dangerous overreach probably depends on how you read the next few years of American foreign policy. Where do you think this goes from here?